Welcome, listeners, to this episode where we talk about food trade. And joining us today is Madam Jeanine Cooper, who served as Liberia's Minister of Agriculture from 2020 to January 2024. You're very, very welcome, Jeanine, to Women Leading Change.
Thank you so much, Lena. It's really a pleasure for me to join you on this very important and interesting discussion forum. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussions.
That's very wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeanine. So just getting into it, as I said, you served as Liberia's minister for about a 4-year period where you spearheaded numerous initiatives. You reoriented the ministry towards agri-business, but your remarkable story started much earlier. In 2009, you founded FABRAR, which is a pioneering Liberian agribusiness, and served as its managing director. Your impact also extends to the global stage. You have a distinguished 13-year career with the United Nations. Your last posting was as the permanent representative to the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa. You also headed the liaison office for the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So this is such an incredible journey that you've had. So to begin our conversation today, could you share what initially sparked your interest in food production and what motivated you to establish your rice-producing company, FABRAR?
Thank you, Lena. It's difficult to say when my motivation actually began because I grew up in an agricultural household. So rice production is part of my earliest memories. And then Liberia's civil crisis was sparked initially by rice riots in 1979, pitting consumers' need for cheaper rice over the producers' need for government support. And my earliest agricultural enterprise actually started much earlier than FABRAR, and it was in the rubber sector. And I quickly segued into rice production. Throughout my work in Liberia and beyond, food security has been a primary focus. So food production, its access, its availability to those who need it and to consumers.
Thank you so very much for weaving the story, of your involvement in this business into, Liberia's history. Could you speak to us of some of the challenges that you've encountered with, this journey into growing FABRAR? And have there been any specific barriers that you've encountered to trading rice across West Africa?
The first challenge, I guess, was going where angels fear to tread in Liberia. Commercial rice production, commercial food production in Liberia had just not been done since the 1970s. And there were an awful lot of mindset changes that needed to happen from the development partners who told us categorically it's not possible to produce rice commercially, to the importers who, of course, did not want to see any challenge to their monopoly on our staple food, to the government of Liberia itself, which didn't believe and was actually very... Nobody wanted to touch rice. It's fine. We don't want to have our government overthrown or have people rioting. Again, nobody wanted to touch it, so the status quo would prevail. And even to the general population who had grown over the decades they developed different tastes, I guess, patterns. Many of the younger generation, and our population pyramid is very heavy, bottom heavy. Many of the younger generation, or let me put it this way, only 5.1% of Liberia's population today were born before 1980. So only 5.1% knew a Liberia that produced rice commercially and produced its own food. So that was the first challenge. And then that created a perception bias. Our initial model was buying from farmers rather than going to plant our own rice. And that was difficult. Getting commercial quantities, consistency in quality and variety of rice, it was a huge challenge. The sector, the market really had no idea what to do with these disruptors coming here talking about commercial rice production. And then getting the capital to start in the face of all of that. I mean, I invested a good portion of my husband's savings to get us started, and then we got an investor, but it took time. And so probably the biggest challenge was sticking to it, to learn from those mistakes, to look at the bigger picture, and not just locally, but also in the region, to brave the export market. And
Yes.
you know that rice is being traded all over West Africa. You can't have the largest rice consuming population in Africa is in West Africa. The largest producers of rice on the continent are in West Africa, specifically in the Nigeria, Mali, Senegal. All of them are close by countries like Liberia, who proportionally per capita, we have the highest rice consumption, but our population is not very large. So the quantity of rice is not that much. It's being traded and it's being shared, and rice is making its way to tables and bowls all over the West Africa. But the barriers are noted when you start to try to track that movement of rice, because it's largely in the informal sector, and governments across the region are trying to outproduce and outcompete with imported rice from Asia. So they put in protectionist barriers, put them in place. For example, Nigeria will ban imports of rice so that they can support their farmers. They don't have the same history with trying to do that Liberia has. Especially they ban cross-border imports. So this just drives the rice trade further into the shadows. There are national programs to support rice production being put in place, but all of our borders are porous and our border communities live a different reality than what we put on paper. So I think those are some of the biggest challenges. And for the record, I did try trading rice in the region, particularly FABRAR and Nigeria. Didn't get as much uptake as I did with the US market.
That's really such an interesting and real picture of the challenges of regional trade.
Yeah.
There's so many, besides the capital and investment barriers that you spoke about, boosting intra-regional trade has just been something that governments, important ones such as Nigeria, have really not, done effectively and in a kind of a positive trade and production promoting way. You bring in kind of the central point to the next question I wanted to ask you around, informality and how, all of these barriers and the policy responses have this effect of driving a lot of trade into the shadows. And that's indeed the case for rice, which is a staple, a key part of West African diets, but for many other products that are grown and imported and all of that in the region. So much of this unrecorded and unreported trade that goes through informal challenge is a huge part of the economy of the region. And one of SWAC's, actually a forthcoming report, estimates that the value of unrecorded food trade in West Africa is as high as $10 billion per year. So that's a significant amount of trade that is happening informally, unrecorded, but policymakers are unable to have a really good picture of it. How important do you think it is for policymakers to come to an acceptance and work with informality, not as this negative feature of trade in the region, but, a reality of how trade is done in the region and responding in a direction that reduces the barriers for businesses such as FABRAR?
Well, I think it's critical. Take a country like Liberia, where most of the funding for agricultural production comes from international development assistance. This funding depends, and projects depend on available statistics and data that the experts, foreign and domestic, understand and know. But our country, as West Africa, is a very high context environment. And we've all become opportunistic in sourcing the funding, unwilling to rock the boat in case we lose the money. So we're not willing to challenge the assumptions that what we see in the formal statistics and data is not all there is. We don't challenge that assumption. And that I think that's crucial for policy making. I'm delighted that SWAC or OECD are looking at the informal sector. Yeah. We have to do this. This is life as it is being lived.
Yeah.
95% and that's almost a 10-year-old figure from one research group in Liberia. 95% of employment in Liberia is in the informal sector. 95 to 98% of the cash that moves through the system is moving outside of the banks. What that means is that your statistics are only showing a part of the picture. And I remember when Nigeria revalued its economy to include the informal sector and services. Kenya also did the same a few years ago. Their economy was shown to be much, much larger than what the statistics are. We haven't done that in Liberia. If you're using flawed data to make your planning, your development decisions, your development is flawed. And that's so we have to be willing to challenge these assumptions. We have to understand that informality that rules most of our economies. And so when you're talking about regional trade, that's the big one, where only a fraction of the trade is actually being measured. Mm-hmm. The informal cross-border trade in food particularly is so enormous.
And you say, the informal sector accounting for about 90% in I think labor in Liberia. 95%. Yep. It's just as high in Nigeria. I think the estimates are about 80%. And these are, conservative estimates. Like, yes, for countries such as Nigeria, I think the informal sector contributes about 65% of GDP.
Right.
And we did a study, on unrecorded trade between Nigeria and its neighbors. I did this for Chatham House, London, and we did this study, I think, in 2015.
Yeah.
And in terms of it's like you say, it's a no-brainer. And we tried to press this case and make this argument of how important it was for, policymakers, people in government, not to ignore or engage with informality. And it was really clear that huge volumes, of even not just food products, but manufactured goods go all across West Africa every single day. So that trade facilitation question is one that is for actors such as yourself, you understand it because you see it on the ground every day, but there is just this, I don't know, this gap between, what policymakers are doing and what real actors who are doing business are in the food trade in West Africa doing. So I hope that with the forthcoming report and this conversation on real issues, that that adds to, just that key argument that needs to be, it seems still need to be made to kind of shift thinking at a governmental level, especially for big actors in the region. And so that is my hope. But I want to bring in, what is a key part of this podcast series is highlighting, the role that women play in West Africa. And in this conversation, the role that women play in the West African food economy. Many a times the contributions that women play go unrecognized. You highlighted this in your article titled Invisible Women, where you spoke about the role of women in rice production. Could you speak to us about your observations on how women can be better supported in the rice sector?
Again, it's another perception bias that we have, because whether it's rice production or food production, women do most of the work. In Liberia, it's upwards of 90%. From storing the seeds, to planting the seeds, to weeding and managing the farms, to harvesting the seeds, the grain, storing it, hand milling it, winnowing, cooking, and then even feeding. Food production is women's work. And that's not just today. That's the way it's been from time immemorial. And it's not just for rice, but almost all food products, vegetables, the edible oils, the spices. It's women who produce those. And I've seen women on the farm bent over double, sometimes with a baby on their back, sometimes pregnant, and on a few occasions pregnant and with a baby on their back, doing this very difficult manual labor. And in addition to what you see on the farm, we know around the world, most of the unpaid work that goes with living in households, the informal work, the caregiving work, the housework, child rearing. On top of her roles on the farm or in food production, women also play those roles. Upward, the vast majority. When you look at how do you empower a woman farmer, you don't just look at her roles on the farm, which is one of the things that a lot of women empowerment projects or initiatives have looked at. How can we give her high yielding seeds, and then she will have higher yields and higher production, and she'll be able to sell more and make more money, and we've empowered her. Well, no. Higher yielding seeds means more production. Her labor is limited. Mm-hmm. So we need to limit, help her to save her labor, whether it's simple things like, having running water in her home. Okay, I know even having clean drinking water is a challenge in most of our rural areas. But just imagine the game changer that having running water in her home would bring. Now, a country like Liberia, where we have 7 months of rainfall and heavy enough rain that can supply us throughout the year, rainwater harvesting can provide her with that water in the home. You add that to basic, even manual tools that are widely available to mill rice, to thresh rice. There's machines that do that, and with far less. They don't even have to be electric. Even manual machines that will reduce that labor, and that frees her up to do more things. To go to school, to educate her children. I think we need to look at it, empowering women from the holistic aspect, not just, we're empowering women farmers. We had started a project like that with the UN, a flagship project with the Ministry of Agriculture last year. We're looking forward to it taking off. I think it's stalled now, but if we can just take a different approach to empowering women and look at how we can help them to do more of the totality of the work that they do in a day. Let's take a different approach and look at women's lives as they live it.
You make really powerful points there, and I hear really very strongly the importance of putting women's well-being, their total well-being, at the center of any kind of empowerment thinking. One of the studies that SWAC has also done, I think this is from 2019 or 2018, about the roles that women play in the food economy. I think 68% of all employed West African women are working in the food economy. And you spoke about, just across, food production, whether it's agriculture, processing, marketing, distribution, food away from home. Women play a huge role. So it's really important to be thinking about, the real demands on women's time in household care duties, their chores, and across the life of a woman, whether she has children, centering women's well-being in whatever strategy and any way you are thinking. So that allows you, to be more dynamic in policy responses and addressing things, not just high yields, not just giving high yield seeds and all of those kinds of very narrow approaches, but thinking holistically and seeing how all of these, dots are connected. So that's really, thank you so much for just that powerful intervention there. Thank you, Jeanine Cooper, former Minister of Agriculture for Liberia and Managing Director of FABRAR, for this enriching conversation. Thank you all for listening to Women Leading Change. And if you liked this episode, check out the other inspiring stories from women driving change. Let us know your thoughts and who you'd like to hear from next by leaving us a comment. For more, visit oecd.org/SWAC. That's oecd.org/SWAC. Goodbye.